Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, Ari. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Really great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Nina.
Great to have you with us. Everyone else in the chat room on YouTube, Twitter, and also Binance Live, please send a message and say hi to us. It's great to have everyone globally here with us for this webinar session. Everyone, great to have you. And I'm Nina Xiang from the Binance Academy team. Binance Academy's mission is to teach everyone about blockchain technology, and we are one of the largest learning hubs in the industry. So today we're very happy to have Ari Redbord, Head of Legal and Government Affairs at blockchain intelligence firm TRM Labs, joining us for a very timely discussion on how should we navigate legal risks when conducting crypto trades. So Ari, great to have you today. And I want to ask you, before we even start today's session, we are like day one after the Ethereum merge. So what did you do yesterday for the merge? How did you celebrate today?
I love it, Nina. No, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's super honored to be on, and it's fun to look even at the chat. I mean, Senegal, the Philippines. This is such an international group, and I mean, guess that's the nature of crypto, right? It is this sort of cross-border, payments and financial system that we're all building together, and it's fun to see sort of people from all corners of the world. So no one invited me to a merge party. And I've always thought I was like a really fun guy. I'm very deep into crypto. So I definitely was not, but I've been watching sort of really excitedly because I think it's a really important moment for the industry. But look, sort of what we're so focused on at TRM is really stopping bad actors from taking advantage of the overall crypto economy. And whenever there is sort of a major event, think of sort of the NFT, drop FOMO scenario, right? There's always sort of a lot of fraud and financial crime. And we're following that very closely for clients, like Binance, for other sort of, participants in the industry. We stood up with actually, we've partnered with Binance on a site called Chain Abuse, where it's a way for people to crowdsource scams and frauds in the crypto community to really ensure that other people aren't affected. And I can say that definitely within the last 24 hours, we've seen a number of Ethereum sort of related scams and frauds, token drops that aren't, we know there's no token drop associated with this, right? But we've seen that. So we're watching that very closely, but at the same time, really celebrating with everyone else sort of about the excitement of this really important moment.
Mhm. I actually personally minted NFT from one of the names that can be trusted. But it was really interesting. It's too late for us to stay up. It was 2 a.m. Eastern, US Eastern time. I saw on Twitter someone said it's uncultured to have an event in this hour for the US Eastern Coast.
Well, I
But
think we're like the old. I think we're like the old folks in the industry. I'm sure there were plenty of young people who were celebrating
yes.
at 2 a.m. in the morning for sure. Yeah.
Mhm. So, okay. So, Ari, can you maybe talk about more directly about how the merge actually impact your work? You talked a little bit about, catching scams related to this event, but on a more broader perspective, how does this impact your work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I promise you this is not a cop out answer, but I think a lot of this is to be seen. Like, I think we're going to see in the coming weeks and months really sort of what this means from a number of important perspectives. One, security, right? Is this creating a more or less secure sort of blockchain environment? And I think there's interesting arguments on both sides, right? Essentially, just for those, and I know this is a very crypto native audience, but for those aren't super in the weeds on this, essentially what's happening is Ethereum is going through a software upgrade. And it's been sort of years in the making. But really, what that software upgrade is doing, in simplest terms, is changing the way transactions are validated on the blockchain from what they call a proof of work, which is essentially mining, which is the way Bitcoin transactions are validated on the Bitcoin blockchain, to proof of stake, which basically requires that those who are validating transactions own Ethereum, are essentially staking in that ecosystem. So it's a real shift. And the real question is, proof of work community, many of whom, sort of the Bitcoin community, are saying, look, what what you're doing is you're transitioning from this system where anyone can mine Bitcoin to a system in which you have to actually own the asset in order to participate. Which essentially it argues that, like, it's less egalitarian in some respects. But what proof of stake is saying is, look, you don't now need sort of server farms. You don't need these giant sort of mining apparatus. Anyone who has an interest or a skin in the game, right? Anyone who is invested now in Ethereum or in the asset has a say in sort of how transactions are validated on that chain. So I think you're seeing sort of different perspectives, and we'll see ultimately how it plays out from sort of like a trust and safety layer. But I think this has been a moment that's been building for some time in the ecosystem, and we're going to see sort of ultimately how it plays out or sort of what it means. I'll take you back though, like just for a moment, sort of that I think that what we're really monitoring closely, like any huge moment in crypto, right? This is like the Super Bowl for crypto. We want to make sure that scammers and fraudsters are not taking advantage of regular users, of people who are now wanting to engage. And that's something that we're focused on sort of in the very near term at TRM Labs.
I mean, especially with what's happening with potentially the ETHW fork. I think that just like by itself creates so many different complications and potential security risks.
Yeah, look, I think that that's very much sort of in line with we're going to wait and see really over the next few days, but maybe even beyond, as to whether or not there's new security risks created as we've sort of dealt with older ones, and yeah, I think it's very much a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so before we go into today's formal discussion, a reminder for everyone to follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and other social media channels, to stay tuned with upcoming webinars and other great educational content from us. And also, if anyone, during the time of the discussion, feel free to send your questions in, and we will try to answer all of them at the end. And a quick disclaimer, very importantly, the opinions and statements made during this webinar are for general information and educational purposes only and should not be construed as financial advice or recommendations. Okay, so Ari, we went into the Ethereum merge without really giving you a proper introduction. And, if you Google Ari's name, you're going to find a lot of his past experience and many of the past talks he's given. But just very briefly, Ari has been the head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs, and he works with law enforcement regulators and financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses to help make cryptocurrency safe for billions of people. And before joining TRM Labs, Ari served as a senior advisor to the Deputy Secretary and the Undersecretary for the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the United States Department of Treasury, and also as a senior assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. So very impressive, past experience. Ari, go ahead.
Whenever I hear anyone say it's just a mouthful, is what it is. It's just like an only in government service kind of titles, but really just look at the end of the day, sort of my role was to work with teams from the U.S. Treasury Department on illicit finance issues. So with OFAC, which is the sanctions regulator, FinCEN, which is the financial intelligence unit, the money laundering regulator, to really ensure that bad actors, right, were not taking advantage of the financial system. So working on sanctions, anti-money laundering type of issues. And before that, I was a prosecutor for about 11 years and for the U.S. Department of Justice, really focusing on those same issues, stopping cyber criminals and terrorist financiers and others from sort of, laundering funds in this new, in the traditional financial system. And now at TRM, I get to do that, in the crypto space as well.
Yes, great. So, today's topic is about how do you handle regulatory or legal risks when you conduct crypto trades. I think the reason why we wanted to have this session was because of the Tornado Cash sanction. And there has been so much talk on this topic. But today we really want to maybe just take a step back and have a broader view of the legal risks. Risk of conducting crypto trades, no matter where you are, or no matter whether you are U.S. persons or not. So I guess first step, Ari, is maybe if you can give us a very brief overview of the global cryptocurrency regulatory landscape. There's so many different discrepancies and also uncertainties, particularly in the U.S. The regulatory landscape is so complicated and fast moving. So maybe you can give us this brief introduction first.
Yeah, Nina, your question makes me believe I need to come up with like a 2 or 3 minute answer to this question. So I'm going to do my, I'm going to, this is, I'm going to take a shot at this. This is going to be, hopefully I could use this. But look, you're right that there are so many different sort of regulatory actions and studies and things happening globally right now in the cryptocurrency space. We have key regulators in places like Singapore and Dubai, in the UK and in the EU. And certainly in the US, really grappling with sort of how to build out a regulatory framework for digital assets. For example, just this summer, we saw an agreement reached on MiCA, the Markets in Crypto Assets legislation in Europe, which was a huge step forward and really created the first comprehensive framework for digital assets. And when I say comprehensive, I say that because, look, we've seen regulators deal with different issues within the crypto space, right? What are the environmental impacts of mining, consumer protection related issues, anti-money laundering, stable coins, CBDCs. But really, MiCA was the first sort of actual legislation to reach agreement where it took a holistic approach to all of those different things. We see legislation, on Capitol Hill in the U.S. that kind of mirrors that idea of a comprehensive framework. That is probably some time from being passed. But Senators Lummis and Gillibrand put forth a bill over the summer that tried to also take sort of a more holistic approach. In the US, the real issue is who is going to regulate crypto? Is it the CFTC, which regulates commodities, or is it the SEC, which regulates securities? But coming back to all of this for a moment, one thing is interestingly clear and is becoming more and more clear globally, and that is sort of what regulation looks like in the anti-money laundering space in particular, which we're talking about in some respects today in the sanction space. In the US, FinCEN, which is part of the US Treasury Department, has said, if you are a cryptocurrency business, if you're an exchange, if you're a broker, if you're a custodian, right, then if you do business with US persons or US entities, you're required to have compliance controls in place, just like any money service business. So that means to have compliance officers, to have policies and procedures, to get a license with your regulator, to file suspicious activity reports, to use a transaction monitoring solution like TRM to make sure that you're not transacting with illicit entities. And that has very much been the approach in the UK, in Singapore, certainly sort of moving towards that direction in the UAE. And a lot of it comes from the Financial Action Task Force, which is FATF. And FATF is not a regulator, but it is a global standard setting body. Okay. And that has been their direction in many respects, that crypto businesses should have compliance controls in place. And that's really what we're seeing globally more and more. We're seeing, crypto businesses act as if they're financial institutions and have robust anti-money laundering, sanction screening, that sort of thing. So that was definitely more than my 2-minute answer, but I hope it was like close to kind of like how we're seeing things today in the space.
So basically, the short answer is everything is still in development. There's no definite framework, or there potentially, the European region is maybe one step ahead of the US, but still everything is still very much in shaping up.
I think that's right. One thing to point out that's really interesting that came out of MiCA in Europe is this idea of a passportable license. So if you're a crypto exchange and you have a license in Greece or Spain, you're able to take that license and move it anywhere else in Europe. And that becomes very important because, as you know, the most important thing to businesses in the space is, like, obviously regulation is important, but regulatory clarity is arguably more important. You just want to know what your obligations are. So it's really nice to know that, hey, if I have a license from this regulator in France, I know that I'll be able to use it in Spain is very significant. And that's a big, I think, step forward when you talk about sort of the regulatory frameworks that Mika sort of brought to the table. But I think your analysis was terrific there in terms of like, yeah, we're still working on clarity, and it's coming. I'm very optimistic, but these things take time. Regulators do not move necessarily at the speed of the internet, like crypto does.
For sure. What about from a user's perspective? You talked about, regulatory landscape for crypto businesses. For users, there is currently potentially the risk of inadvertently breaking rules. Maybe, sometimes not by the user's own actions, particularly from the Tornado Cash sanction action.
Yeah, happy to talk through Tornado Cash because I think you're absolutely right. And interestingly, yesterday, OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the sanctions entity within the U.S. Treasury, actually came out with some FAQs, some frequently asked questions, which is essentially their way of putting out timely guidance. And one of those FAQs got to exactly what you're talking about. It was essentially, and I don't have it in front of me, it was essentially, hey, what is OFAC's position towards someone who has been the victim of what they call a dusting attack, right? A small amount of cryptocurrency has been sent to you, and you did not you did not ask for it, you did not solicit it. It was sent to you kind of inadvertently. And what OFAC has said, I think they were very careful, but what they said, look, sanctions are strict liability. And if you have violated sanctions or if you have engaged with a sanctioned entity, you need to report that. But, and this is an important but, they said, enforcement actions in this space will not be a priority for OFAC. And that is a way for OFAC to say, hey, look, on the one hand, we're a strict liability regime, and you need to report this type of activity. But what they're also saying is, look, we understand that this is not the group that we are trying to enforce sanctions on. This is obviously, these are victims of people who are trying to sort of make a statement or send funds. And we want to be clear to those people that they are not going to be targets of OFAC enforcement actions. So I think that's their subtle way of saying, hey, look, this is not going to be something we're going to prioritize. It's probably but to really try to, I think, get to the heart of your answer, let me sort of move back a little bit. And I know folks are probably tracking this very, very closely, but on August 8th, the U.S. Treasury Department, OFAC, sanctioned Tornado Cash, which, as you know, is a decentralized mixing protocol on Ethereum. And essentially, it sanctioned Tornado Cash because of its involvement in laundering what, by TRM's account, is about $1 billion in hacked or stolen funds by North Korea. And as we all know, over the last couple of years, really, North Korea has been targeting cryptocurrency businesses, centralized exchanges, and now much more often DeFi protocols and bridges, and stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. And there was a time where hacks were a fraud or financial crime issue. But when you have North Korea involved, it really becomes a national security issue, because when they stole $620 million from the Ronin Bridge, that is funds that, if they can launder them effectively, they can use for weapons proliferation and other types of destabilizing activity. So what we see here is Treasury trying to figure out how to deal with the use of Tornado Cash for money laundering. But Tornado Cash is exceptional because it's really the first time that OFAC ever designated really not an entity or a person, but in this case, sort of decentralized software. And on the one hand, OFAC wanted to stop North Korea from being able to use Tornado Cash to launder funds. But on the other hand, it impacted a lot of regular users who had a reason to keep their transactions private and were using it for sort of the right reasons. And what we then saw were people, individuals, I think, going back to your question, who were affected by really OFAC sanctions, arguably for the first time. Up to the Tornado Cash designation, OFAC had always gone after, really, I'd say, illicit actors within the overall crypto ecosystem. Darknet mixers, right, that were being advertised to launder funds. Darknet marketplaces like Hydra and Silk Road and Alpha Bay. They were going after non-compliant exchanges that had no KYC controls, mostly Russia-based, like Suex and Chadex and Garantex. But this was really different. This was the first time that regular users were affected. And I think what we've seen over the last month since the designation are crypto businesses, including DeFi front ends and others, and centralized exchanges, and regulators and OFAC trying to figure out how to balance this idea of going after ensuring that bad guys aren't using our services, but not affecting regular users. And I think that's been the interesting conversation that we've been having over the last month or so. And I think it'll likely continue, for some time.
And of course, the OFAC sanction is being legally challenged right now. So I guess that's also another a good move toward, I guess it's another positive move for users who want to protect their privacy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that ultimately there'll be litigation likely, and we'll kind of get a result, which will be sort of some time from now. I also am optimistic that there are potentially technological solutions that can actually do this. Because on the one hand, look, I get asked all the time by people kind of new to the space, well, why would you ever use a mixer unless you were trying to hide, transactions, unless you're trying to launder funds? And my answer is, look, as we move into a more and more open financial system, people are going to have very good reason to want more and more transaction privacy. For example, we're going to be paid in crypto. I know you love Binance, but do you want Binance to know exactly what you do with your paycheck? Right? Probably not.
I think we will have very strict
Yeah,
control,
or
internal control, and
or
very strict
or TRM
policies.
or TRM. If I'm sent
Right.
funds directly to my wallet from my employer, TRM, I don't want them to know about what I'm using those funds for, right? That's just like I don't want anyone to see my credit card transactions today. There are, and I think the other piece of this is that people don't realize, there are a lot of public figures whose crypto addresses are just out there. They're on Twitter, they're .eth, and those people don't want the world watching, what they're buying, cars and diapers and the things that we all buy in life. So I think the reality is that people have really good reason to keep their transactions private. And I think what we're going to do, and this is something we've been really focused on at TRM, working really closely with clients to ensure that we're screening for sanctioned entities, like anyone on the list, but to find ways to take a more granular approach to ensure that those victims of dusting or others who have inadvertently transacted with this protocol are not ensnared in kind of a wider sanctions net. And that's really we've been heads down, since this designation, really working closely with clients to ensure that they're taking our data and then sort of taking a granular approach to decide which addresses to block and which addresses not to block. I think, you see most companies in the space are really, saying, we understand that we have an obligation to block the 45 addresses that are on the sanctions list, right? The question gets more complicated when even Tether, who famously came out and said, we're not going to block, what they were saying is we're going to block those 45 addresses, but we're not going to block necessarily those secondary addresses that have transacted with the 45. But we're seeing different approaches by different entities within the crypto ecosystem. And I think that there are all kinds of reasons to take different approaches. And every business, every crypto protocol has their own risk tolerance, risk-based approach. And that's what we're seeing implemented now, which I think is a good thing.
So another related news was recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, NFTs were used to funnel funds. I think for North Korea or some terrorist organizations. So NFT is something, I guess. I'm not so sure how to comply with sanctions, and just ensure you stay within the legal bonds when you transact NFTs. Is it safe to just stay with the biggest NFT marketplace? Is that something that you can do to minimize risk there, or what other extra legal risks do you see there when you transfer or receive NFTs?
No, it's a great question. And just backing you up a little bit, first of all, I can't wait to see your merge NFT you mentioned. Do we get to see that on the show, or maybe later?
Oh, I still haven't even opened it yet. It's just in my wallet. I'll see.
Awesome. All right, maybe you'll share that with us. So, no, it's such a cool space, and it's such emerging technology that I think it's just so important to kind of understand sort of what the regulatory frameworks are today. One thing, kind of backing you up a second. So TRM did an investigation about a week or so ago where we identified an NFT that was created by an ISIS supporter, and I think that's what you were referring to.
Right.
And it's really important to make the distinction that we do not know if this is ISIS itself or ISIS even knew about this, but this was a supporter who created a series of NFTs actually that were sort of, ISIS propaganda. And really, it seems like a one-off to some extent, right? But what it does tell is kind of an interesting story about a world in which, illicit actors, terrorist financiers may be moving more into this decentralized space that we're all building together. And we, I think, have to ensure that they don't, right? That bad actors don't. And really, what happened was, look, in the age of the internet, you had intermediaries, Twitter and Facebook and companies that would deplatform this type of content. But in the age of crypto or NFTs or blockchains, we're living in this decentralized world where things are hashed to a immutable ledger. It's forever. And I think what this person in particular, this supporter, understood was that, like, when you create an NFT, it's there forever. No one can take it down. Now, if it's on a major marketplace, then obviously that marketplace can take it down because that's the intermediary. But the reality is, no matter what, it's always going to be there on that blockchain. And I think that's so. I think it's like just starting to think more about which ways illicit actors are going to use emerging technology. This is not at all to say there's some huge problem in the NFT ecosystem with terrorist financing, but I think it's sort of the first time that we saw, at least, the use of NFTs in this way. From sort of like a regulatory perspective, because I think you ask a really good question. I think it's one of those issues you talked about, sort of clarity, that regulators are definitely grappling with. I think that there's analogies you can draw from sort of crypto regulation today, which is a lot more built out. I think regulators are still really starting to talk about NFTs, but I think the concern for regulators with NFTs, at least in the sort of money laundering, sanctions, illicit finance space, is that, look, you can move them at the speed of the internet, right? Cross-border value transfer. You can use them for payments, for investment, to transfer value. And I think that's why you're going to see some sort of compliance controls in place. And you see already today the leading NFT marketplaces, exchanges that offer NFTs to clients are already using tools like TRM to do transaction monitoring on the addresses that they're sending NFTs to. So it's really, I think there's a lot of good analogies to make today. I think that at TRM, we cover Ethereum, we cover Solana, so we have a pretty good sense of most of the NFT activity out there and are able to sort of provide data to allow our clients to make those decisions. But it's a growing space. There's no question. And we're seeing regulators really, just like, for example, I mentioned Mika. Mika doesn't really address NFTs. And I think intentionally wanting to sort of like follow up with more study and really try to understand it in sort of a Mika 2 type of context. So I think it's an issue we're still seeing regulators grapple with. We've seen the US Treasury talk a little bit about it, 3 or 4 pages in a much larger white paper on the use of art, high value art, to launder funds. But we're going to see a lot more from Treasury. We're going to see a lot more from UK regulators and Singapore. The FATF has talked a little bit about NFTs. So it's definitely it's an emerging space from a technology standpoint and also from a regulatory standpoint.
Sorry, I may miss the point, but I mean, there has been a lot of, I guess, speculation that people do say a lot of the high value NFTs are used for money laundering purposes. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, look, I think that, like, yeah, I mean, sure. I think what you're seeing now is, and if you want to launder funds in crypto, high value blue chip NFTs is a great place to move funds, right? And then sort of move those funds again, sort of laundering the money. So I think it's definitely a typology we're seeing. I think at the start of the show, I mentioned this kind of, things around the merge that we're seeing potentially, but things like NFT rug pulls, right? We've seen a lot of, typologies around people essentially pump and dump in the NFT space. We've seen wash trading of NFTs. We've seen Discord hacks, of sort of NFT Discord. Um, there's so many different sort of typologies we're seeing in the space, but I think so much of it goes to this sort of FOMO idea, right? NFTs induce so much fear of missing out amongst the community that people are sort of more likely to click here, and maybe that's not the right site, or maybe that's going to drain your wallet. And quite frankly, that's why I think it's Binance US, we started Chain Abuse in order to have a place where people could, really, report and investigate these types of fraud and scams. And a lot of it happens to be in the NFT space today, because the NFT space, honestly, is this sort of new and emerging nascent industry, nascent space where we're building, but that allows for some vulnerabilities, and we've seen that.
Mm-hmm. And the FOMO factor is real for sure. And
It
you
is
see so
real.
many
I
airdrops.
have it on these things. Oh yeah. I, I have two young boys, and we collect NBA Top Shot together. And
Right.
oh yeah, I'll click on anything. Like I'm just like I'm in the queue. I'm like, come on, like I want that pack. NBA Finals this year. So yeah, so like I totally get it. I think the space is so cool and so interesting. But yeah, any kind of new space or big event leads to that kind of FOMO, which is catnip for fraudsters and scammers.
Mm-hmm. So back to the NFT ISIS connection you mentioned before. When you were talking about that, it just brought back all my memory while I listened to your previous talks. So that's exactly that I was referring to. But I listened to so many of your previous talks. I
No,
guess
that's so
it's all
nice.
mixed up.
I'm embarrassed. Yes, yeah. I'm sure you're
I-
very sick of me. Yeah.
No, this is like part of the research I do, like always for all of the webinars. So, but I think another interesting point you raised before was like TRM actually, doesn't block addresses. I think for this clarification is quite important that you're just an intelligence data provider. And it's on the crypto businesses that does the blocking action.
No, I mean, you said that quite frankly as succinct as I could possibly say it. But no, that's exactly right. Look, at the end of the day, we're providing data to clients, whether they're large centralized exchanges or DeFi front ends that make determinations as to how to use that data. And so we provide data on, hey, look, these addresses are on the SDN list; they are sanctioned. And then the crypto entity decides, the crypto business decides whether or not to block those addresses. Same with addresses that have sanctions exposure because they've transacted with those addresses. Just to kind of like dig in a little bit on this, because it's really interesting. Look, sanctions actually has always been pretty easy, certainly compared to anti-money laundering, which is really different. And people tie them together all the time. We talk about sanctions and AML, but the reality is they are very different. And really to date, the addresses on OFAC's sanctions list have really been associated with terrorist financing. Today, OFAC added literally a couple hours ago a number of addresses associated with Russia paramilitary group that is in Ukraine, and added those addresses. But the issue there is that if you're a terrorist financier or sort of one of these types of groups, you know crypto platforms don't want you on their platform. They want to keep you off, right? Like, no one wants to transact with a terrorist financier. And you even take that a step further. If you're transacting with a terrorist financier, I probably don't want to transact with you either, right? So you can automate the process. You can say that if you have a sanctions label, or TRM is saying you're associated with sanctions, then you can automatically block those addresses. But Tornado Cash was so different because it was the first time that you had regular users who could potentially have been associated with sanctions exposure.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's why so like TRM is providing that data to allow crypto businesses now to kind of take a more granular approach to say, hey, no, it might not just be enough that it's associated with some sanctions exposure. Maybe we need to know more. And this is data that TRM provides. Is it inflows or outflows? What is the timing? What is the amount? And the amount becomes really important, right? When it's just dusting, you're able to tell that or have a much better sense. So what we're seeing is really in the last 3 or 4 weeks, even, crypto businesses take a more granular approach to this. And I think that when I talk about sort of technological solutions, I think that's what I'm so excited about, because I think there are ways to solve this problem with technology as opposed to over regulation.
Did you talk about those technological solutions before?
Yeah. So
You want
yeah.
to?
So, yeah. No. Absolutely. Happy to. And really, just kind of like echoing. Look, I think that what we allow is when we're providing data to clients, they're able to make pretty granular determinations as to whether or not this is an entity that they want to engage with.
Okay, that's what you
And
mean.
I,
Okay.
and I think as opposed to sort of, having regulation that says you can or you can't, it's like there are now entities that are really or that have really good data to make these types of determinations. And we might not need regulators necessarily saying
I
you can
see.
and you can't. There's technological solutions to this, which I think we all want, right? Like as a community, as what we're building, we want to ensure that we can sort of self-police some of this using tools and technology.
I see. So I don't see any questions from the chat room. So I guess everybody's very much, caught up
Or
with
they're or
the
they're or or
legal.
they're bored of me, or they're
Yeah.
they're they're looking at the light off my bald head or something. I don't know.
They're all enlightened.
Yeah, yeah.
They're oh yes. So if you have any questions, remember to send it in. This is your chance to ask the expert in the field. And I think lastly, Ari, if you can maybe give some advice to regular users. It doesn't matter, if you have $100 or a big portfolio. What are some recommended safety best practices? Maybe potentially do not use mixer services, or I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
What would those be?
No, it certainly wouldn't be that, right? Like I think that there's such an important place for mixers in the ecosystem. I think it's just trying to figure out sort of how to stop bad actors from using mixers. And I think that to some extent, that's really sort of that's got to be where we kind of thread that needle. But for regular users, I think it's sort of most importantly, it's staying vigilant from fraud for purposes of like fraud and financial crime. And it's being vigilant in a number of ways. It's being vigilant on chain, right? Trying to really understand the entities that you're transacting with, whether it's an exchange or whether it's another self-hosted wallet. I think to really kind of understand who you're transacting with is important, and not necessarily the name, but like, make sure that they have a legitimate web presence. If you're dealing with an NFT project, right? Make sure that like you do some due diligence, because it's like anything else, Nina, right? Like I'm not walking down the street handing my wallet to like a random person. You want to just ensure like, I might not know who I'm transacting with all the time, and that should not be expected in crypto. But what should be expected is that like you actually have a sense that the person you're transacting with is legit. And I think doing some due diligence there, really becomes important. I think going to like an NFT, drop with just enough money in your wallet to buy that NFT you want is a great idea. Because what we're seeing now more and more is these sort of wallet draining techniques, right? Where they're stealing all the funds out of your wallet. And it's terrible to lose anything. But I'd rather lose whatever amount I was going to spend on NFT than than the entirety of my wallet. So like that's like the tips and tricks, like, but a lot of it is just goes back to sort of this bigger picture of like really remaining vigilant. And that's kind of like, and there's so much more to that on chain, but it's really also being smart off chain, having good operational security.
I'm sorry. Before
Yeah,
you go into the
yeah,
option
yeah.
stuff, like I would almost definitely, use a different mobile phone or hardware if I want to interact with, less established brand names, and also use a different email. So definitely don't want to use the same phone. I keep all my, other financial holdings with one that I decide to go, maybe potentially a little bit more riskier entities to interact with.
You nailed it. I think actually you just went where I was going.
Okay.
Because
Oh,
like,
that's
what are the
where the option stuff is.
well,
Okay.
yeah, like, what is the
Oh,
safe
so
yeah.
sorry.
No, no, you're totally fine. You answered it better than I should just shut up because I think
No,
you
no, no.
yeah, no, yeah, no. I think that, it is sort of that operational security, like, to avoid being SIM swapped or having your accounts hacked or having people get access to your passwords and usernames for your, Binance account or, whatever. I think part of it is like, yes, these exchanges and DeFi protocols and bridges are being hacked, but the actual much easier one is for us individually to be taking advantage of in some way. So I think it's that just same OPSEC that you would just bring to kind of your daily life. You should just ensure, and it's not just you, right? It's your family members, it's your children, and it's look. I mean, we're in a scary world right now. I mean, like every day I get some text that says, "Hey, Ari, long time no see."
And
Like
knows you everything, knows your background, where you went to
it's
school,
really
and
crazy.
yeah.
Like it's like, oh, and it's really detailed. And there was a time where I would always respond, "Who's this? I think I must not have you in my phone." Well, that's a scammer, who's basically going to try to then take advantage in some one of these sort of groom you in one of these pig butchering scenarios where they get a bunch of money from you in crypto and then ultimately steal it. You just have to be like, I think our spidey sense should be tingling all the time. And no one wants to walk around that way. But I think the reality is, as we move into the digital world, these are the new threats. They're the robberies that we've dealt with on, subway systems and on city streets. We now have to be just as vigilant. You put your wallet in your front pocket when you're walking, you know, through a big square in Europe or something. I think we have to do that now on blockchains, and it's just smart. But believe me, it's hard to do all the time to stay that vigilant. But I think you really nailed it the way you described it.
Well, thank you so much, Ari. And we have no question from the audience today. And I want to remind everyone that we previously had a session with Binance compliance department. So we introduced all the different kind of scams and phishing attacks you may encounter. So make sure you watch that one as well. So Ari, thank you so much for today's enlightening, highly insightful sessions and advice. And it's great to see you and talk to you finally. So I hope we can meet someday in person.
I would love that, Nina. Thank you so much for taking the time, and really
All right,
love the
thank you.
love what you're
Yeah,
doing. Bye.
thank you. Bye, everyone in the